All right, well, it looks like we're just a couple minutes after 7, and we may have a quorum, so let's go ahead and get things going.
Maria Ryan,
Here.
Amelia Neptune,
Here.
Todd Rusk, Brian Spruill, Rachel Valenga, Stephen Wald,
Here.
Ryan Wolber.
Okay, well, we still do have a quorum. So and Rachel just showed up, great. And hopefully Brian will show up because we do have a new member this evening that, and it'd be great to meet him, so hopefully he'll be along shortly. Brian Spruill. So he is actually with the State's Attorney's Office and has a background in environmental law. So, and he's actually sat through our December meeting and maybe one of our other meetings as well, so, yeah. I also want to bid a fond farewell and good luck to Amelia, who has, already started a position out in Washington with it's the Bicycle Friendly America program.
Yeah,
Great.
the League of American Bicyclists.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time that you spent on the commission, and we're going to miss you. And I know you're only in the community for a short time, but I'm glad you were able to contribute what you did.
Thank you, likewise, and I want to thank everyone on the commission for your time and for letting me be a part of it for the last year.
All right. So let's move to changes to the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda this evening? Okay. Nope, and here's Ryan. Let's move on to the approval of minutes from the previous meeting. And why don't we start with if there are any changes, and then maybe get any changes in order prior to taking a motion on it. Are there any changes to what was in the packet? No. Is there a motion to approve?
Move to approve the previous month's meeting.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. All those in favor of approving the minutes signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? Okay, they are approved. And we'll move to public input. Do we have any members of the public who would like to address us this evening? If you could state your name and address for the record, please.
Carol McCusick, 1907 North Cunningham Avenue. Some things to remind about was that I thought that the contracts for the use cycle would be good to have that online, so you can see before they come up for renewals any dimensions of them. That's one thing that was from before. Also was the idea of, since there's fee money through the municipal electric aggregation, to use it to think about government information issues, because they have the potential for payoff in energy efficiency. Some of the things I feel of is the publications of things that are updated. Should it be web publication for that? There might be a couple of reasons for that, but I guess what I'm thinking of is that there should be to think about democracy issues. There should be a democratic kind of a process for it. That would seem to be to go with the idea. And okay, one of the things that I'm thinking is that when we have questions about the Open Meetings Act, it would be nice if the questions asked and the answers were somehow web published. One thing that I'm against now lately, suddenly, I guess, is rescheduling and cancellations. I think that emphasizing the calendar of regular meetings is good, and for the openness of meetings. And it's not so bad to have the rule that you can change your schedule for annual meetings and give 10 days notice of that. I don't know if it has to be before the date it's rescheduled to, or before 10 days before the date that it was originally scheduled. So have to ask the public access counselor, you get an answer, and who's going to know about it if I write to them and get an answer back? You know, that's the kind, or who's going to know if I write to and say, does every commission have to have their own, really have to have their own recorded rule for public comment, or is it good enough that our city has one now? You know, what, like, I guess I'll stop there. I really like the idea of having, there are a couple of reasons to have a roster on the agenda, and also a process for that, both, you know, who's going to be serving associated with the meeting coming up, and also you have a historical record for accountability. You know, it would serve both ways. And that leaves communications. That's another big anticipating and historical dimension of meetings, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other members of the public who wish to address us this evening? All right. Let's move on to our communications and to the monthly staff report.
Good evening. First thing on the staff report, I included in the packet PowerPoint slides regarding, it was an assessment of what it takes to go through a brownfields remediation process in the state of Illinois. Just listed the different operations and grants and so forth, different legal issues that have to be considered. And I've shared this with community development in the city, and what we've determined is at present that's still an interest to address brownfields remediation in the city of Urbana. However, we have current staff levels and funding levels do not allow us to take action on that at present. The Climate Action Plan goals are moving along in the Urbana-Champaign Energy Star Challenge. We have 40 buildings registered and taking part. We recently had an Energy Star Challenge launch party and lunch and learn where we trained folks on how to use Energy Star Portfolio Manager. And we had 15 different building representatives. It says XX in the report, with that number as placeholder for 15. We've also sent out, this is also past tense now, we've sent out a mailer using a business list from some permitting in the city. We've sent out a mailer to all the businesses in the city that is serving a couple purposes. One, it's driving folks towards Ameren's commercial energy rebates programs. Two, it's driving folks towards the city's TIF program. For those folks who are in the TIF program, there is some extra points built into TIF incentives for energy efficiency. And three, it's driving folks towards an online survey that is part of our goals in the Climate Action Plan. Recently, we had a meeting with City of Urbana staff, U of I staff, some other city staff, where we hosted a company called Invenergy. They own a facility called California Ridge. That's the wind turbine facility on the edge of the county here. And we had them present what their company does, how the wind energy market works, and how we might be able to get involved with our city facilities energy purchases. What we came out of that meeting with was that the pricing is higher than grid price or retail electric supply. We figured that, but it's not that much higher. You do have to sign up for a long-term contract, 20 years. But the biggest barrier for Urbana is that our demand for the electricity consumption of our facilities represents about 1/2 of one wind turbine. So they're not going to go to Wall Street and finance a wind facility to put up one wind turbine that they can only sell half the power from. So what that means is if some other large institutional purchaser like U of I or Tennessee Valley Authority or Ameren, if they come along and say, hey, we need to buy more renewable power, and they provide the backing for such a project for 20, 30, 40 new wind turbines, well, then we can kind of piggyback on that for our half of a wind turbine. That's not happening yet, but it's something that we've communicated to others that we're interested in exploring if it's possible. You all should have received in the packet the annotated bibliography, which I think we had talked about and shared a draft of before, and it's summarizing current research and reports about the efficacy of renewable energy credits. That I didn't go to a great detail in turning that into a fancy document with the intent that as new information became available, it's just a memo format. We can just add to it. And that's for our use. That's to share with the public, and that's to share with council and mayor as anyone asks. The city and hundreds of other cities in the United States and thousands of cities across the world are members of an organization called ICLEI, and one of the primary benefits of this organization is they provide greenhouse gas accounting software. It's what we use to measure and model our greenhouse gas emissions, and we also use it to project emissions into the future, and we also use it to create scenarios of how we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. They are updating their software. It's going to be a modern web-based integrated tool. They've shown it off at a webinar, and they've released a sort of a trial version for a select number of cities that includes Urbana. So we're going to start digging into that, and I'm hoping that it's going to be fairly simple to use and really powerful for our planning purposes. I do expect that because the tool has changed and because we don't have any of the original data from when our 2007 baseline was created, that our baseline year, 2007, might change slightly. We have Ameren giving us huge data sets now of all our consumption, but it's not necessarily the same data set they gave us in 2007. So they're querying their database differently, our model's different. So it might be slightly different, but I don't expect that it's going to be monumental. Moving on to hazardous waste management. This is regarding city facilities, particularly Urbana's Public Works facility, which is essentially an auto maintenance shop. Well, part of it anyway. We had invited the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center to come out. They have an office for compliance assistance, and they will visit facilities and do a walkthrough, look at your storage and disposal procedures, record keeping, and they provide a report and recommendations about how you can improve your practices, stay in compliance with local, state, and federal rules. So we had ISTC come out and do this for our facility. It resulted in a report, maybe 10 pages long. We distilled that down into a 2-page checklist of about 32 items or 30 items, and we shared that checklist at Public Works in January of last year and gave ourselves a 12-month time frame to complete all those items, and we've completed 90% of them by the end of the year. Really what we have left are updating material safety data sheets and reviewing if there are opportunities to replace existing chemicals with less hazardous chemicals or less caustic chemicals. Let's see. The RFP for our one-day rain barrel, we did this last year, has gone out. It's due in a couple of weeks. Responses are due in a couple of weeks. Last year we sold 450 rain barrels and 173 compost bins. This doesn't cost the city anything but staff time and maybe some printing costs and that sort of thing, but it doesn't really cost a lot of money. We host a vendor on a competitive bid, so we get prices about half of retail for rain barrels and compost bins. Recently, ISTC, the county, and some cities participated in an informal meeting where we looked at some possibilities for creating a carpet recycling service here in Urbana. And what we discussed was a company out of Chicago that has their own facilities for processing used carpet. They're willing to drop a semi-trailer and just pick it up whenever we call and tell them that it's full for a flat fee. In order to decide whether, is that a lot for recycling or a little for recycling, we took a look at what we pay, what City of Urbana pays for recycling for our existing services by the ton. So if you look at the graph, curbside, single-family residence, U-Cycle, we spend about $80 a ton for that form of recycling. Multifamily recycling, about $200 a ton. And then our battery recycling at, I think, 5 locations throughout the city, we spend $2,000 a ton. Now, you can see there's a lot less tons of battery recycling. It's just per ton, it costs more to recycle batteries. By comparison, the carpet recycling was about $80 a ton. So in terms of our demonstrated willingness to pay for recycling, it's in the ballpark, certainly. That doesn't necessarily mean that all the partners that are looking into this have the extra cash to make this service reality. We have really no expectations of how many trailers we might go through of carpet recycling in a year. But that's a new opportunity that we're looking at. Similarly, the city has become a member of the Product Stewardship Institute. These folks work with particular industries to create processes where on the front end, the cost of recovering and recycling a product is paid for, so that when the user is done with the product, there's already a paid-for existing system to take that product back and recycle it. So they've been very successful in doing this with paint stewardship in a number of states throughout the country, and they've introduced, they're working with the American Coatings Association, which is the paint industry association. American Coatings Association has introduced ISTC model legislation into the Illinois legislature to establish a paint stewardship program here in Illinois. It would add a small amount of fee on the cost of a paint can, and would set up waste paint collection points at vendors throughout the state. They have a goal of making something like 90% of residences no more than 20 miles from a collection point, something like that. So we're supporting that legislation as well. ISTC, again, we're getting a lot of support from ISTC. They performed a waste and recycling audit here at the city building. The report from that is attached. It's in the packet. One of the interesting results from that study, that they actually they go out to garbage cans, dumpsters out back, and they sift through and identify and sort all the garbage and all the recycling. And what they found was that the largest recyclable constituent that was in the garbage was just office paper. So that tells us, it tells us what our problem is. We have to figure out a little more specifically why that's happening, but it's a fairly straightforward one. So it's easier to have one big item that's in the garbage rather than lots of small amounts of lots of different items, easier to tackle. We've had a follow-up meeting with them, and they're interested in using the city as a proof of concept for some grant-funded research they want to do, focusing on improving recycling in a commercial facility. So we're going to proceed with them and design some interventions to improve the recycling rates here at the city building and measure the outcomes. Our next regularly scheduled meeting would be March 4th at 7 p.m. However, Kate tells me we need to schedule or set reoccurring meetings for the rest of the year so that we can go ahead and announce that those are the regularly scheduled meetings.
All right. So just in terms of making it official that first Tuesday of the month at 7 o'clock.
Right.
All right. Do you need a motion on that, or
I don't know,
just-
but we might as well.
Okay. Is there a motion to set our schedule for the rest of the calendar year? Rest of the calendar year at the first Tuesday evening of each month at 7 p.m.
I will make that motion.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Is there any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed? Okay, that motion carries.
Can I ask a couple questions from the staff report?
Yeah.
So, how much is the landfill per ton for the carpet? Do you know?
It would just be whatever their normal tipping fee is. I think it's something in the $30, $32 range.
So it would be almost 3 times. And so, according to this chart, the city recycled half of what it could have recycled. Is that correct?
What are you looking at?
Weighed material by class.
Let me go to that. What page is that?
4. It says
Yeah.
35% was recycled,
So,
but
mhm.
34% was recyclable.
Yes.
Okay. And that's mostly paper.
That's the largest single constituent.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
Can I ask a question about the ICLEI software?
Mhm.
I remember from a conversation in my previous job, that's a couple years old now, that Champaign was using a different software. Do you know if they've moved on to using ICLEI?
So Champaign contracted the Regional Planning Commission
Mhm.
to create their greenhouse gas baseline.
Okay.
So I think that RPC just pulled together data sets and did their own math. I don't think they used another group's
Okay, so it looks like
software.
they'll continue to do that instead of there being...
I don't know what their plans are.
Yeah.
I think we are the only municipality in the county using ICLEI, but it's the single most popular software in the country, in the world.
I guess as far as feedback goes, I would just want to encourage the entire county to switch to using ICLEI so
Mhm.
that we can have region-wide sort of baselines and tracking over time.
Yeah, one of the questions that came up in the webinar where they were showing off the new tool was, can multiple cities, say in the same county, do their own data, but then aggregate afterwards so that you could have both views. And that's not in the tool presently, but it seems like something that they might be able to do eventually.
Are there other questions on the report? All right. In that case, let's move to our next item, which is a presentation by Mike Brunk, our city arborist, regarding the Legacy Tree Program.
Good evening. Tonight I'd like to talk, this is my first opportunity to talk to the SAC committee, so I'd like to cover a little bit about our urban forestry program. I'd like to describe our forestry maintenance program and its present needs and what I think the needs of the future are, and then an ordinance that we just passed that's very exciting called our Legacy Tree Ordinance. And I'd like to start out by painting a picture. If most of us have thought about planning our future, we think about our investments in the future and we steer ourselves towards looking towards the investments that have the best guarantees. Well, planning the future for our community is no different. And especially if we're planning for a sustainable future, we want to look at a guaranteed investment. And I'm here to tell you tonight, probably I'm singing to the choir, but the guaranteed investment is trees. And it can be that simple. Absolutely, it can be that simple. So let's break it down. Trees provide an economic vitality to our community. And how they do that is they attract people, people attract business, and therefore business, then both people and business attract revenue to a community. Well, that's the tax base of a community that supports the basic community needs such as police, fire, and public works. I think that in itself is reason to prioritize investment in trees. But secondly, trees provide ecological benefits. Now, with our recent inventory that we just completed in 2013, we studied eco-benefits of our trees. And I'm about to show you that here in a little bit. But we found out that the Urbana public trees are estimated to provide about $2,635,931 in eco-benefits, and that's each and every year. On a national scale, trees provide a 3-to-1 return on investment when comparing the annual eco-benefits to annual maintenance costs. In Urbana, our Urbana trees are providing us a 4.5-to-1 return. So we're spending about $38 per tree per year on care, but we're receiving $173 per tree per year in eco-benefits. If those two things aren't enough to prioritize trees, then consider this. Trees are the only component of the infrastructure, the city's infrastructure, that increases in value over time. It's a slam dunk in my opinion. So Urbana is flush in trees. In fact, our program has probably the most diverse urban forest in the Midwest and certainly one of the most dense. Let's look back in history. I thought this might be interesting to everybody. This is from our archives. We have an inventory back in February of 1932. There's just a couple blocks, or a few blocks around the community that were inventoried. This happens to be East Washington, west of Cottage Grove. They look at the tree's condition, the size of the tree, and they comment whether the tree needs to be trimmed or not, much like we do today. The interesting part of this that we probably all realize is that out of the 24 trees, 23 of them were elms, most likely American elms. Well, this is from our inventory last summer. Compared to over 70% American elms back in the 30s and 40s, we now can boast that we have no tree over 6% in any one species. We have over 153 different species in our urban forest, and only our top two are above 5%. The sugar maple and the red maple are somewhere around 5.5%, but everything else is below 5%. We're doing pretty well in the genus makeup as well. It's suggested that you have no one genus over 20% of the total tree population. Our maples are right at that. So we have some work for the decades ahead to work on that component as well. We also have a very exciting public tree map where we've provided the ability for the public to access some of the data that we've collected in our tree inventory. And this is accessible to the public. And what we've done here that's a lot of fun is that we have, see if I need to refresh this. Excuse me for a second. Make sure it functions. What we've done is we show the eco-benefits of our entire forest. Now, the other unusual thing with this inventory is that we inventoried street trees and public park trees. So we have all of our public trees on this inventory for the Urbana residents to view. And out of the 15,193 trees, we have the $2,635,000 eco-benefits, as I explained. But we break this down further. So we have the greenhouse gas benefits that we show in dollar value. We also show that in the CO2 that was avoided and the CO2 that was sequestered. We have water benefits that we show in a dollar value, but we also show the gallons saved from the water that was absorbed by these trees that didn't go down our storm drains. We have energy benefits. We show the kilowatts saved and the therms saved. We have air quality benefits that we show with the pounds of pollutants that these trees absorb. And we also show property benefits. Well, we'll just randomly pick a tree, and those benefits are for our entire urban forest. But if we pick one tree, if it will let me do it, it will show the eco-benefit of that particular tree. We also have trails. Let me see if I can call up a tree this way. But that should be interesting to people. We have notable trees, trails that we have on this map that we can highlight. I'll talk about those a little bit. We have the Hickman Tree Trail that's in Carl Park on this map that can be highlighted. We are starting a Best of Species trail. We have the Illini Grove that can be called up on this map. We are starting a Big Grove Trail that we have a few trees on this map, but it's in the works. And we have a Fall Color Tree Trail. The Fall Color Tree Trail is to, I'm still not getting a, is to show us, highlight some of the trees in the fall and some of the colors they provide. Well, our internet's not working with me tonight, but I encourage you to visit our website, which is urbana.mytreekeeper.com. It's an interactive website, and we have just started to introduce that to the public. So let's talk a little bit about the Urbana Tree City USA program, our forestry program. We've been in the Tree City USA program for 39 years. We're a charter member of that program, the longest ongoing member in the state of Illinois, and one of the longest ongoing members in the nation. Tree planting is a big part of our program, as well as tree assessment. Tree assessments for the preservation of our trees, as well as public safety. We look to find hazards before they fall apart. This happens to be a hackberry tree that we discovered, that we abated this limb. It was over 2,000 pounds that was about to fall smack dab in the center of a house, and we were able to abate this before it failed, fortunately. This tree we didn't. This is another hackberry. It failed in a storm and fell across Race Street right there at the intersection of Oregon Avenue. And if you look closely at where this tree detached, and I'll talk a little bit about our preventative maintenance here in the slideshow. This is what we call in the industry as included bark. So this tree had a weak attached branch that grew into a large branch, and the storm eventually caused it to fail. We work a lot with kids. This is one of the more fun parts of my job. Certainly every Arbor Day we plant trees with our school children, but I'd say we interact with kids probably about a half a dozen times in the year. More recently, I was working with them on finding some of the special trees in our community, and I'm presently searching for these trees right now. But we also work with the big people of the state, and we've worked with legislators and worked to create laws. In this particular situation, we were an integral part of creating and improving upon utility tree trimming, where we created a specific law that stated that utility tree trimming needed to follow the latest International Society of Arboriculture standards that hadn't existed before this law. So our main component of our tree program is maintenance. That's our bread and butter for keeping our trees safe and preserving our trees in the community. And that has evolved over time. In 1975 to about 1992, we basically managed our trees in a reactionary manner by citizen requests, and that's how Public Works does things. People call in to have a pothole fixed, or they call in because they have this heaved sidewalk or some part of the infrastructure is broken. We put it on a schedule to repair it. Well, trees were no different. Although we had thousands of these calls, and it pretty much dictated what we did. It didn't really get the trees what they needed. We tried to incorporate clearance pruning that was more preventative, where we'd go down and we would actually trim trees to clear the streets and the sidewalks before the trucks would do it for us, to protect the trees and, of course, the people that were using the corridors. But the reactionary management of being overwhelmed with all the citizen requests really kind of dictated to us what we did and really kept us from doing the preventative maintenance. In 1992, we started to change that policy. We would start to tell people when we transitioned over into a preventative style of management that we would not do their request pruning unless it was a hazard. And we would tell people that we were a hazard abatement program only. So we wouldn't necessarily come and trim the small limb that was too low, or we wouldn't come and thin the tree out because they couldn't grow grass. We limited our efforts to hazard abatement only so we could spend the majority of our time in preventative maintenance. There's a lot of things that we have to cover in a given year, and this is a sample that shows the year divided into two sections here, and the different various programs that we're involved in during those times of the year. But we cover tree removal, we cover hazard abatement throughout the entire year, just about weekly. We kind of dedicate a Friday to go out and get the hazardous trees that were called in or that we discovered. But we have a time that we concentrate on tree removal. We have a time that we concentrate on stump grinding, 2 times a year actually. We concentrate on tree planting 2 times a year. We concentrate on what they call a visibility triangle clearance. So we have to go out to every intersection in the community and make sure the sight lines for traffic and pedestrians are clear. We also clear signs in those visibility triangle clearance jobs. We have the city on about a 3-year cycle to where we get through 1/3 of the intersections in a given year. We also have a time frame where we have to go out and trim trees for the engineers that have projects for road improvements, so they can be clear for the trucks that are coming with the beds up and hauling asphalt and things like that to protect our trees, and of course the vehicles that are using the roads. And we try to dedicate, after all of that stuff, we try to save aside as much as we can for what we call cyclical preventative maintenance. And that's where we go into a neighborhood and we trim the trees from the very top to the very bottom, and we cover all of the bases. That is the very most efficient way that we can trim our forest, is when we go down the street and we touch every tree right in a row. And that is preventative management, and what we, the benefit of that is for both tree preservation and public safety. What we look to do. Well, if you remember the picture I showed you of the hackberry that failed earlier in the slide presentation that had the included bark, when we go through town and we trim our trees from top to bottom, we look for bad connections. We look for younger branches with included bark so we can prune them off appropriately so they don't rip off a tree or so they don't grow into a large branch and fail. We look to eliminate codominant stems. We look to remove dead wood and repair broken branches. So we look to repair the tree. We also want to train the tree with a strong scaffolding and central leader. We look to remove structurally weak branches, and we look to maintain a natural form in the tree. Well, we don't have a list of 11,500 trees and we go from one to the other. We really divide the town into neighborhoods. This is our snow removal map that we use, and we divided the town into 14 management areas. And we would send our crews into one area, focus on that particular area until they got all of the trees trimmed, and then we'd move on to the next area. We were told when we started this process, you'll never get it done. Don't even try. You just don't have the time to get through town and touch every tree from top to bottom. It took tenacity, but we got through it, and it took us 13.5 years. Was it worth it? It turned out that it was. What it achieved was, if we look at our 1997 inventory, which we were 1 year into the trimming program at that time, that inventory found 816 priority tree hazards. Now what these were trees with dead wood or problem branches that were larger than 6 inches in diameter. After we got through our program, we finished that around late 2009, I believe. We look at an inventory here in 2013, about 3 years after that. We only found 135 priority tree hazards. And on top of that, we had changed our system on how we looked at those. So now we're looking at trees with dead wood and dangerous branches over 4 inches in diameter. So we would have expected it to increase. But instead it was a 75% reduction. So we had made our urban forest much safer by going through town and touching the trees from top to bottom. We also increased the longevity of our urban forest and really increased the vigor and the health of our urban forest. Why is this important? Okay, let me get to my point. If we look at the last 10 years and what we have removed in trees and what we have planted, we're barely keeping our head above water. We've removed 1,104 trees over the last 10 years, and we've planted 1,274 trees. That gives us a net gain of about 170 trees. Not a lot. Well, if we go back even further, in 1997, we had a tree population, as per the inventory, of 11,225 trees. Our last inventory showed us that we had 11,579 trees, so we've gained 350 trees. So our tree count or our forest has grown, or has it? If we look at the gray infrastructure of our community at the same time frames, in 1997 we had 116 linear street miles, which puts us at about 96 trees per linear street mile. In 2013 we have 135 linear street miles, which now we only have 85 trees per linear mile of street. So in reality, what our urban forest is doing, it's thinning as our community grows. And I think that's the more accurate way of looking at the comparison. Our gray infrastructure is outgrowing our green infrastructure. The gray and green infrastructure needs to be viewed as symbiotic rather than separate entities. So we're behind the 8 ball. We need to catch up. How can we best increase our tree population? The best approach needs to be multifaceted. Surely we need to increase our tree planting, but only as much as we can train trees on a 3-year cycle. In other words, we don't want to throw thousands of dollars at a contractor coming in to plant all these trees that we don't have time to plant because we don't have the staff that can maintain those trees, that can train those trees. If we don't train those trees properly on a 3-year cycle, then we're going to end up with trees that are problems, and that's going to take us away time-wise from maintaining our healthy quality trees. The next thing we can do is reduce our tree removals. I don't necessarily mean put an unrepairable tree on hold for a couple years. I mean reduce the unrepairable tree population that we have. And how can we do that? We can shorten our cycles. We need to be better at getting through town in a shorter cycle than 13 and a half years. We also need to do additional tree work on our trees. We can afford the time. We should accept no less than a 7-year cycle for our program. Both of these are going to require an increase in staff. The other things that we can do is intensify maintenance on our significant trees of the community. I think I hope we can approach this kind of goal through our Legacy Tree program. We can improve tree sensitivity during infrastructure maintenance and development. And certainly we should continue to work towards using less salt. Salt is extremely toxic to trees. The other things that we can do is look to preserve our trees through our plan and permit process. I'm a part of the plan review process as permits and plans come into town, along with engineering staff and community development staff. I'm, of course, the city arborist. I try to be very objective and reach out and stand my ground when trees are of a high quality, trees that I think that need to be protected. If they're a not so good tree or a volunteer tree or a bird planted tree, I might not stand as strong as I do on some others. But in certain situations, I've had to use innovation to really make my point. This is a sample of where I have cyber pruned a tree. There was a request in this permit to prune a tree in order to allow a 2-story farmhouse down this street. They were moving the house. And pruning a tree doesn't sound too bad to most people. I didn't think I could really significantly make a point in explaining this to people in writing, so I painted it. And I pruned the tree in Cyberville, showing what kind of pruning was being requested of this sugar maple. And this is a nice sugar maple. It's actually in our inventory now, noted as a notable tree. Good chance it'll be a legacy tree in the future. And the permit was not approved. We saved the tree. Here's about a 75-year-old pin oak over by Pravina, another one that was presented to us in a plan review for development. The request was to remove the tree because it was in the way of a development. I stipulated, requested that this tree was significant enough that we should salvage the tree and that we should ask the developer to provide us some ideas on how they can work around it. I lost. The Skyway took precedence in this particular situation and over the tree. I'm hoping with our new tree inventory and legacy tree program that we can give some of our significant trees in the community a little more importance. I'm just one guy speaking up and arguing to salvage some of these trees, and I would think that our legacy tree program, if the tree would have been designated a legacy tree, that it would have provided a little more oomph to my request to salvage the tree, not only for the community or the developer, but for our own staff. There's some ways that we've outreached to the community to protect trees on private property through some of our tree care publications, and the Under the Canopy is one of our more popular publications. And we've also outreached to acknowledge some of the unusual trees of the community through tree trail guides. But tree removal has never been so easy. With the technology that we have today, it's much different than what it was 100 years ago. Trees can be removed in minutes rather than days or weeks. Crane removals in backyards are common. A one-cut lift and the tree is gone. And the equipment companies have kept up with this technology. Not only can you one-cut the tree and lift it over a house into the front, but now you can chip an entire tree with equipment. These are real money makers for our communities. And so we have to work harder to try to save trees, not only on our public lands, but our private lands, because of the push of some of these trees being removed at a faster pace. We hope that our new legacy tree ordinance will help serve that purpose, will help enhance our tree preservation ordinances. And this is one of the reasons that we pushed to come up with a tree preservation ordinance in this community. This is a unique ordinance. It's a volunteer program. It's one that we feel that is very important for the community to get involved in for it to be successful. The major goals of our legacy tree program is to go out and find the significant trees of our community. We're looking for the community to help us find those trees. We want to recognize those trees, and through a public awareness program, we want to promote them to the public and make them very well known. We hope that combination provides some sensitivity that we don't have nowadays with development, so we enhance our sensitivity for protecting these trees. And we hope also that this program brings community involvement into our tree program. We have a percentage of old historic trees in the community. Some have plaques and certainly regarded as heritage trees. A number of them are considered to be a part of the big grove. But we also have many other interesting public trees and private trees. There are trees of size, rarity, trees in a valued focal point, such as at Maine and Springfield, the white oak and the island. We have older trees, over 100 years old. We have ecologically special trees or valuable trees. This particular oak, we think, is a cross between a willow oak and a pin oak, although I've gotten about a half a dozen different answers from various professionals. Nobody's really keyed it out to be exactly what this is. This is one of Willett Wandell's special trees that came from Wandell Nursery. Willett picked it out himself with Bill Kreidner, and the tree ended up here with Bill Kreidner, Bruno, and Willett Wandell's hand in it. And this particular tree has all these leaves on this one tree, entire leaves and lobed leaves. It's very interesting. We have a number of aesthetically beautiful trees, or aesthetically unique trees. And we have group trees of significance. We think this group on East Main is a part of the original big grove of this community. So our legacy ordinance is looking to encompass not just our older trees or our heritage trees, but a number of different types of trees. So we've created these 8 standards that we look to utilize in selecting our legacy trees for our community. While we were developing the legacy tree program, we were also inventorying the community at the same time. So one unique thing, I should say another unique thing that we did with this inventory is we started to search for some of these significant trees. So whether they were on public or private property. And we titled them notables. And we have over 100 notable trees in our inventory now, that some of which most likely will become legacy trees. The overview of the legacy program is that we have a nomination process that any and all residents can nominate any tree. It's a voluntary program, so there's a consent component to this where we would require the written consent of the property owner if a tree is nominated that happens to be on private property. There's an assessment component that I'll talk about in a little bit. I make a recommendation to the Tree Commission based on that assessment. The Tree Commission votes whether the tree will be accepted as a legacy tree or not. We're looking to create participation benefits for this program and a public awareness campaign. And we have a specific process for the removal of these trees. The tree assessment is basically covering 3 items that we look at. We want the tree to be viewed from the right-of-way. Also, the tree needs to be in good or better condition. And the purpose of that is that we want to promote healthy trees and we want to promote good arboriculture. So for example, if there's a tree that's not in good condition that can be improved by some good arboricultural practices, then we want to be able to promote that to the private tree property owners so they can practice or hire somebody to practice those good arboricultural practices and bring the tree into good condition. We hope that in that sense we're promoting arboriculture and we can increase the vitality of our private trees component of our urban forest. And then of course the third part of this is the legacy tree assessment, the standards that I just talked about, those 8 standards. Delisting legacy tree, we have 2 different ways to do that. If the tree is unhealthy, if it becomes unhealthy and unrepairable, it's a pretty easy process. It's a 7-day waiting period. It gives me time to go out there and inspect the tree. If it's not obviously unhealthy and unrepairable, then we ask that the homeowner provide me with a certified arborist recommendation to remove the tree. And to protect us and the homeowner, if the tree happens to be in imminent danger, if it's hit by lightning, it's ready to fall, they certainly can remove the tree before they even receive a permit from me. Removing a healthy legacy tree. There's a 45-day wait period on removing a healthy legacy tree. And the purpose of that is to allow public input. I will go out in that 45-day period and I will post a pending removal sign for the community to see that this legacy tree is being requested to be removed. It will list the date that the Tree Commission will have set up for the community to come and say their piece on this removal process. That serves several purposes. Our community has been very successful, I should say the citizens of our community have been very successful in the past in saving trees from development by this very process before we ever had a tree preservation ordinance. On their own, groups of citizens have spoken up at development areas and saved trees in this very manner. The second component of this is it allows the community venue to speak out. It allows them an opportunity to say their piece. So people of the community can say, hey, that tree, even though it's on private property, is important to me. The owner has no binding requirement to follow what the people say. The Tree Commission has no authority over that owner. The owner can still remove the tree after the Tree Commission. The owner, we invite the owner to come to the Tree Commission, but they're not required to come to that meeting, but we do provide the minutes of that meeting to them in writing. Public awareness is a big part of this. We've already received national attention from the ordinance. We did get some local press on it as well when the ordinance was passed. We intend to put our program on the city website. We intend to have literature for contractor packets. We look to create an annual legacy tree publication that will list the new trees of that particular year and the sponsors of the program. We hope to create a tree trail guide, and the map that I showed you will have the legacy trees on them. And we're looking at plaques and certificates as a trail from our State Street tree trail that we may look to mimic. And our website again for our tree inventory map, urbana.mytreekeeper.com. Some of the plaque ideas that we're looking at, whether we keep the plaques similar to what we have around town, or we look to be more creative so they stand out. We studied the fiscal impact, how many trees we thought we could put into the program and handle with our present staff. We looked at low-cost markers. We looked at high-cost plaques and some of the cost to provide mulch and as a benefit to some of the participants. The last thing I would want to say is we didn't want to tie this program to our city budget. This budget is very thin, and we didn't want to wait to introduce this program or to try to utilize this program depending on when money was available. So we're approaching this particular program with the fact that we're going to try to fund it through private donations and sponsorships. We're looking to provide an avenue for donation with the nomination form, for example. We're looking to start a fundraising campaign. We're seeking partners for startup funds and seed money. We're working right now we're working on creating individual and corporate donor levels. And certainly we'll take advantage of the federal and state grants if they become available. We've had some past success in doing this. We've not held ourselves to the tax dollars in our program. We've been able to create some educational campaigns through donations. And some of the grant money, we've been able to acquire about $170 or more in tree-related grants. And we've been running the Landscape Recycling Center for the past 22 years. We brought that into a self-sustaining status, and we've kept it there ever since. So we've had some success in working above and beyond tax dollars. And that's my presentation. Is there any questions?
You mentioned you have a fundraising campaign. I was just curious, how close are you to your goal?
Well, the first thing we have to do with the Legacy Tree Program is pass an ordinance that allows me to solicit funds for the program. But we have already received funds, in fact, before we've officially even started the fundraising campaign. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we can keep the word out there and keep people interested. We had an interesting situation with one of our largest hackberry trees that we're removing, and it's been in the paper quite often lately, where the community came together. We practiced, and actually it was Steve's idea to post this tree much like we would in the Legacy program. And it's really turned out to be a positive thing. People wanted to get involved with this tree. So it allowed us to explain why we're removing the tree. It allowed people to come up with ideas on what they wanted to do with the tree. I think because of the Sim Hackberry, we have gotten a few donations for the Legacy program before we've even started a fundraiser.
Mike, thanks for the presentation. I did have a couple questions. You are, I've come to understand, well, an excellent city arborist for Urbana and an arborist who's really known around the country among other city arborists as being a leader in the field. And I was just wondering if you could reflect for us some of the differences between Urbana's program and that of some other cities. I'm thinking of specifically some places I've lived in my adult life where tree removals required a permit. And arbor programs funded by permit fees. And then the sort of public notice, the sort of provisions that would be available to legacy trees under the legacy tree program are sort of universally extended in a city, in that, you know, you need a tree removal permit. It's a public event. It's something that's posted on the tree, and there's an opportunity for notice and comment through the permitting process. And if I understand it right, many cities have construction-related permits where trees will be, you know, one of the arborist's job is to come out and secure trees on construction sites and make sure that the drip lines are fenced and that there are provisions for trenching and for piling materials on site and things like that. Now, I admit some of these examples I'm thinking of are larger cities, so I don't know if it's a matter of budget or if it's a matter of what the barriers might be towards a program. I don't know if it's a more robust program or not. I think you run a pretty excellent program here in Urbana, but those provisions like permitting for public or private tree removals and construction-related caretaking of trees and sites and things like that. You probably have experience of that from colleagues at national meetings and things.
Sure.
I'm just sort of curious.
We do have a permitting process for public trees, but not for private trees. And a part of us researching our tree preservation ordinance for Urbana, we looked at 3 levels. We looked at a light level all the way up to a very mandated level that controlled everything of, say, 4 inches and larger, that private or public property. It was decided by the city and the city council that we wanted to start out with our tree preservation ordinance for this community on the light side. We wanted to start out and we wanted to attempt to achieve tree preservation through a voluntary program. So we steered away from the mandated city coming in and saying you can't remove any of these trees on your private property. We wanted to start with more of a volunteer program. So that's how we've looked at that, at least in recent years. Our program, it seems to be, from what I know of urban forestry and what I've experienced across the United States, it's looked a little bit differently in different parts of the country. For example, the west side, the west coast, seems, in my experience, to look at urban forestry as canopy cover. Canopy cover is very important out there. Public safety and maintenance is a little less important or less focused on than it is in the Midwest. In the Midwest, we're highly focused on public safety and maintenance, and it's just a little different way of looking at the programs. The one thing that we're a little different here in the Midwest than we are in other communities is we've broken free of the request pruning that so many communities are stuck into. And when Joe Citizen calls, they get put on a list, and that has dictated a reactionary style of management for their trees, which is very expensive. It's very inefficient, and it's very expensive. And if you can just envision 100 calls coming in a community being shotgunned over the entire community, and how long it would take a crew to go out and get all of those, compared to 100 trees that are right in a row going down the street and getting one after another, you can imagine how much more expensive it is to trim trees in that manner. So we're a little different there because we've broken free of that. We're more preventative.
In the on that web page, the inventory, there is some interesting data on eco benefits.
Yes.
The quantified eco benefits, and so anyways, that's some really interesting data. And so I'm wondering if you're able to talk about the basis for those numbers and how they came about.
Yes, actually. We used the USDA iTree program that was developed by Davey. I have the publication with me tonight that goes into how those values were formulated, and I can share that with you if you'd like. If you have an email, I can send you a link to it.
Yeah, actually, if that could go out to the full commission, that would be great.
Okay, sure.
And then another one that was. Oh, I'll wait for you. You made a point. It was just kind of a passing point about toxicity of salt, and health of trees. But, so it just, it raises a question about roadway maintenance, and are there alternatives less toxic alternatives that are also effective? And so anyways, are there, are we stuck with what we have? Are there alternatives? Anything to share on that?
I don't think we are stuck with what we have. In fact, I think Public Works and the present operations manager is doing a very good job in looking at alternatives to salt. One thing we've done is the operations uses a liquid brine now rather than rock salt. And if you can imagine rock salt coming out of the back of a truck, it bounces. And it bounces off the target zone, so it bounces right into the parkway where the trees are. With liquid brine, it's a salt solution. It uses a lot less salt. It's a percentage of salt, if you will, and it pours onto the street. So we're more efficiently using salt to keep the snow from adhering to the concrete or the pavement. The change in salt use really started, in my opinion, back in 1994-95 when I think the Mississippi flooded. And the barges couldn't bring salt up the river. And they quickly discovered that having a shortage of salt, that the communities were very hungry to get the salt for that winter, that they could raise the prices. Well, the prices never went down. And in fact, what's taken place since then is that the communities are forced to purchase bulk amounts of salt well before they know how much they need. So we get into a situation in the springtime where we're trying to use up all the salt out of the dome so we have room for bulk salt that we've already purchased. And even if the winters aren't bad, we have an oversupply because we've committed to a bulk amount of salt down the road. Now this may be changing in the future, but I think one of the management styles that some communities are doing is they're combining their efforts to create a massive dome that many communities can use instead of having one dome of salt for every community. And that's one way they're trying to combat this problem of buying bulk amounts of salt. They can buy bulk amounts and have it a place to store it, not have to make room for it every spring when the new batch is going to come in. So that's part of the problem. I think more recently what our operations manager has come to Arbor and looking for alternatives for melting snow on sidewalks, for example. And they're playing with beet juice, and they're playing with other different chemicals. We've used urea in the past, which is a fertilizer, to melt some of the snow on sidewalks. So there's alternatives to that, and we have to stay on top of that. I have no scientific proof that it is causing our trees to decline, but I know for a fact that the sugar maples that we used to have line Green Street, we've lost most of those now. And we're losing our sugar maples that are lining Elm Street. Those trees were planted by the Women's League of Voters back in the early 1900s. And I can find no reason other than probably pollution that is causing their decline. They've been here for over 100 years. So I credit that to the salt that's been used over the past 20. So I make a pitch whenever I can we have to keep up our efforts to reduce salt use.
Just to follow up on that, I was going to ask a similar question about any sort of educational campaigns you know of here or examples in other communities to educate homeowners and businesses about sidewalk salt use in the winter.
I don't. That's a good point, but I'm not aware of any.
A couple questions. One is just simply whether we could get a copy of your slides for your presentation
Sure.
this evening. That'd be great.
Sure.
And the other, I noticed in the criteria that you consider for the Legacy Tree Program that there was, mention of the ecological benefits, and I didn't have time to read the fine print. And I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit on which of those you kind of press on for the Legacy Tree Program.
The benefits for the participants?
I'm sorry, the ecological benefits, they were among the 8 criteria that you consider for naming
Oh,
Legacy
yes,
Tree.
okay. So, there's trees out there that may be very important to a particular area, whether it's wildlife habitat or say it's erosion control because of the base of the tree is going to keep a very important area from eroding away, or it can be what I presented there as a tree that's just genetically rare. So there are the situations out there that we wanted to encompass that we're not aware of presently, and that was one way that we tried to encompass some of those situations. And we saw that use of that kind of definition in other programs.
Are there any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, and we have next a presentation by Molly, and I hope I'm going to pronounce your name correctly, Willozin?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Climate impacts and adaptation.
And Mari, if I could provide some context real quick. Phase 1 of the Climate Action Plan calls for the creation of a task force to investigate climate impacts and adaptation here locally, or at least regionally. And we had decided that this commission could serve the function of that task force. To that effect, I've asked Molly to come and speak to us today about climate impacts. She's with the Midwestern Regional Climate Center, which is here in Champaign.
Great. Thank you. So once again, thank you for having me here. I'm going to speak with you tonight about local climate change impacts. Like Scott said, I'm the extension climatologist at the Midwestern Regional Climate Center and also Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant, both of which are located at the University of Illinois. So before we talk about the impacts, I just wanted to briefly talk about the climate of central Illinois. As a continental climate in the middle of the United States, we have a wide range of temperatures throughout the year, from cold temperatures in the wintertime to hot temperatures in the summer. And you can see that by the monthly normals graph on the screen. In terms of precipitation, we typically receive the most in May, and July being second. But it's not just these normals that make up the climate of a location. It's also the extremes that we've received in the past and will continue to receive in the future, like heat waves in the summer months to very cold temperatures in the winter, which of course we've had our fair share of this winter. Heavy precipitation can cause flooding, and also in the wintertime this could come in the form of heavy snowfall or a blizzard. And of course drought is also a part of our climate here, especially with negative impacts being felt in the summer months. So when we're talking about climate change, I just wanted to briefly talk about the difference between that and climate variability. A natural variability in our climate is a fundamental component. We see variations naturally ranging from seasons to decades. Things that control this natural variability, for instance, are atmospheric processes like El Nino or La Nina. So with climate variability, if we look at this graph, which is showing the annual temperature for Urbana, you can see there's quite a bit of fluctuation going back to the late 1800s in our annual temperature, pretty much bouncing around between about 48 degrees and 56 degrees Fahrenheit. So this year-to-year variability is what is that natural climate variability that we see. On the other hand, when we're talking about climate change, scientists are looking for long-term and persistent shifts in the climate of a location. So these shifts are lasting anywhere from several decades to longer. So if we look at that same figure again, if we look at the overall trend, you can see that temperature has increased slightly for Urbana, Illinois. So amongst all that year-to-year variability, we do have a gradual increasing trend in our temperatures. Climate change has been happening for hundreds to millions of years on Earth. There's lots of controls of climate change, ranging from natural variability in solar output, large volcanic eruptions, and also humans changing the composition of the atmosphere. So because of this year-to-year variability, it does make it a little bit difficult to look at trends and historical data to see what's been changing. But using the information that we have and also the impacts that we've already been experiencing from climate events, and also using model projections, we can kind of get a better idea of what we might be able to expect for the future. So the topic of global warming or global climate change has emerged as a major scientific and public policy issue. Oftentimes, though, it's difficult for us to relate to things in a global sense. Like sea levels are rising, sea ice is melting. These things don't impact us quite as much here in central Illinois. And also, as we look into the future, the impacts of climate change are definitely going to vary across the globe. Depending on where you are, the changes are going to be slightly different. So it's important that we not only look at the global picture, but we also look locally. So tonight I'm going to just show a little bit of the historical trends that we've been seeing here in central Illinois and what changes we may already be experiencing. Then using future projections, we'll look at what changes we may experience and also what kind of impacts we could have as a result of those changes. So since we are going to talk about climate models and future projections, I just wanted to briefly talk about the uncertainty in climate models and also where this information is coming from that I'll be presenting tonight. So why is there uncertainty in climate modeling? Well, climate models are a simplistic representation of the atmosphere. They are very complex. Oftentimes they take supercomputers to actually just run one simulation of these models. But there are a lot of atmospheric processes that are not completely understood yet. For instance, the impacts of clouds and what impact they have on our climate system and how they'll respond to warming temperatures. Other regional features like topography or the Great Lakes, those are more difficult to model. So that's why we have uncertainty in our climate modeling. Do scientists trust what's coming out of these models? Well, many scientists do trust the data that they are putting out. A lot of reason that they have this confidence is because that these climate models can somewhat accurately represent what happened in the past and what's happening currently in terms of climate change. So that gives them the confidence to use this as a tool to look forward. So the information that I'm going to be showing today for future projections is mainly coming from the 2013 National Climate Assessment. And I did provide a handout for you about the National Climate Assessment. So this is done every 4 years by the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And the assessment is a great way to look at the current state of science and what the projections are showing for the country. So that's where a lot of the information is coming from, and they do a great job at regionalizing the information as well. So tonight I'm going to talk with you about 5 main climate variables: temperature, precipitation. We're going to take a little bit closer of a look at extreme precipitation. And then finally look at plant hardiness zones and freeze-thaw events. So temperature projections. I'm sure many of you are aware that many climate models are predicting that it's very likely we'll have an increase in temperature in the future. Exactly by how much is kind of where the global climate models vary a little bit. But overall, models are predicting by mid-century we'll have about a 3.5 to 5.5 degree Fahrenheit increase. By the end of the century, this could be on the order of 9 degrees Fahrenheit. But what about by season? Are we expected to see this warming uniformly across the year? Well, climate models are showing that it's likely that by the end of the century, the largest increase will most likely be in the summer. However, in the short term, we could see greater increases in the winter time. What is the climate data showing for Urbana? So before I get talking about the trends, I just briefly wanted to talk about what we're looking at here on this graph. So the blue line is representing the average annual temperature for each year. So for instance, in Urbana, you can see 2013 had an average temperature of about 51 degrees. The red line on this graph is showing the moving average. So this line is added to help us remove some of that year-to-year variability or that noise that's associated with our climate here in central Illinois. So by adding this line, it helps us to see the overall trend a little bit better. So looking at this graph, you can see that we have had a slight increase in our temperatures in central Illinois. If we break it down by season, we've actually had the greatest warming in the spring season so far. And this trend is a statistically significant upward trend. In the summertime, we've also seen a gradual increase, but nothing quite as significant as the spring. So even though the seasonal variations aren't quite as definite in the future in terms of climate modeling, we definitely see this overall increase in temperature reflected in the current climate data. So what would a continued increase in temperature mean in terms of impacts? Well, if we look at it by cold season impacts, not all of them may be negative. For instance, having warmer temperatures in the winter could mean decreased energy use and also reduce the risk for cold-related illness and death. One of the negative impacts of a warmer winter could be that we don't have as much killing off of the pests that are bothersome in the summertime. Especially this winter, the very cold temperatures are a good thing for farmers because these pests are dying naturally. So in the future, if we do have warmer temperatures, we may have to deal with this a little bit more in the summertime. In terms of warm season impacts, public health issues may become more prevalent, like more heat waves and also ozone pollution due to warmer temperatures. That decrease in energy use in the winter could be offset by the fact that we could be using more energy in the summertime. And a longer growing season is possible for agriculture, which of course could be a positive thing as well. In addition to increased carbon dioxide could be good for crop growth. However, agriculture could have other negative impacts like drought, the pests like we just talked about, and also possibly temperatures that are too hot for optimal growth. And finally, other impacts of increasing temperatures could be our native species have to migrate to a different area, and also we could have new introductions of species to our region. So looking just a little bit more specifically at heat waves, which are nothing new to this region. We've been dealing with heat waves for several decades now. However, in the future, as we have increased temperature and also an increased humidity is expected as well, we could see an increase in the frequency, duration, and intensity of heat waves. So if we look specifically to try to quantify this change, there's a study that was done in 2012 that looked at extreme events for cities across the eastern U.S. Indianapolis was probably the most comparable since it's at a similar latitude. So this study found that the frequency or number of events per year for heat waves by mid-century would be about 4 events greater than today. The duration of each event could be about 2 days longer, and the peak intensity could be 5 to 6 degrees warmer. So as we're planning for the future, it's important that we think about those vulnerable populations and providing things like cooling centers where they can find some relief in the summer during these heat waves. So we just explored how temperature might change in the future. Well, temperature is a variable that is connected to many other components of the climate system. An overall increase in temperature can have impacts on things like our precipitation patterns, the intensity of our precipitation events, and also things like lake levels. So we're going to look at some of those different variables today to see how they may change in the future. Overall, precipitation for the central Illinois is expected to increase slightly by the end of the century by about 3 to 6%. If we look at it by season, we actually are experiencing the greatest, or we're expecting, according to climate models, the greatest increase in the winter month, the winter season. And this figure is from the National Climate Assessment that shows that we could receive anywhere from 10 to 15% more precipitation in the winter in the future. Along with this change in winter precipitation, we could see more falling as rain instead of snow because of the increasing temperatures. Spring and fall are also expected to have a slight increase, but summer is where we might see our slight decrease in terms of less water available during this season. So data for Urbana, Illinois shows that we actually have been reflecting this increase in overall annual precipitation since the late 1800s. On this graph, you can see there is actually a very steady upward trend towards higher amounts of precipitation. Today, we typically receive anywhere between about 35 and 50 inches per year. Going back to the early parts of the record, it was lower, about 25 to maybe 45 inches a year. Looking at it by season, we actually see a little bit of differences between what climate models are predicting for the future. If you remember, climate models are predicting less in the summer, but we actually have seen the greatest increase in our precipitation in Urbana in the summer. So there is a little bit of conflicting information there. If we look at the winter season, there has been a slight increase, but not too drastic. So as we think about overall impacts, it does make it more difficult when projections in the historical climate data doesn't necessarily align with one another. But let's think about what an overall annual increase might mean for our region. Well, this could be good for groundwater replenishment, of course, and our water resources. Increasing the permeable surfaces to ensure that this water is being absorbed into the ground is definitely one thing that is good to do, so we can make sure we're actually taking advantage of this extra water. However, one negative is that this extra precipitation could potentially come in the form of extreme events, and we'll talk about that more in the next slide. The shift in seasonal precipitation, like I said, is a little bit more uncertain. So with summer, we do have uncertainty between more or less. So what's important is most likely just to plan for variation. We definitely may still have drought in the future, as well as possibly more precipitation in the summer. When we're talking about the spring season, an increase could mean a greater risk for river flooding, putting the floodplains at risk. And finally, if we look at a change in winter precipitation to having more fall as rain instead of snow, this would increase our risk of flooding in the winter, which isn't too great of a concern right now. Also, we could have more rain falling on frozen ground or snow. We've had this happen a couple of times this winter, where it causes a lot of runoff as you have that melting snow and the new rainfall. So if we look in particular at extreme precipitation, I mentioned that the overall increase in our precipitation could come in the form of more extreme events. Well, why might we see this increase in intensity? Well, a warmer atmosphere can hold more water vapor, so it is likely that atmospheric moisture may increase in the future. So when it does rain, or snows for that matter, we could potentially be seeing more precipitation associated with each event. This figure here is showing the annual number of days with precipitation over 1 inch. Climatologically, in the past, we've seen about 5 to 7 days per year, and in the future, by mid-century, we could experience about 2 days more on average. A study that was done back in 2012, the same one that we looked at for the heat waves, also found a similar increase in extreme precipitation. So looking at historical data for Urbana in terms of precipitation events and the intensity. So this is showing the frequency of our larger storm events ranging from 1 inch or greater. So just to explain what we're looking at, the blue bars are showing the first half of the record prior to 1952 and the frequency of each of these events. The red bar is showing the frequency after 1952 until today. And all the way on the left, we can see these are events measuring between 1 and 1.5 inches, to the right, which is showing 3 inches and above. So if we focus in on the 2 to 3 inch range, we can see that we actually have been experiencing an increase in these number of events. The other events are fairly similar to what they were in the past, with the exception of 1 to 1.5 inch storms, which we have seen a decrease. And as I mentioned, this would not only apply to rainfall, but also snowfall as well. So snowfall intensity for Urbana, you can see back in the early 1900s, we actually had, on average, more accumulation for each snowfall event. So compared to then, we are less today. But if you look at the overall trend over the last 70 or 80 years, we have been experiencing a slight increase in our snowfall intensity. Even comparing it to the snowy decades of the 70s and 80s, were very comparable to the data back then. So with all of this talk about greater annual precipitation, heavier rainfall events, snowfall events, you may think that drought is going to become a thing of the past. In fact, that's exactly opposite of what climate models are showing. Overall, they're showing an increase in both forms of extremes, heavier rainfall and snowfall, and also drought. In particular, looking at the central Illinois, this figure is showing that we could have, I know it's a little hard to see with the colors, but about a 5% increase in drought from what we're experiencing today. If we look at the country as a whole, we can see that we are staying pretty close to normal compared to other parts of the country, like the desert Southwest, where drought is going to be a major issue, most likely in the future. So impacts of extreme precipitation, well, higher intensity rainfall, it's fairly obvious. We could be dealing with more flooding issues in the future. And also water quality issues may be another thing that we have to think about. With more rainfall coming into the system during one event, we may have more runoff on the surface, picking up pollutants and creating non-point pollution. So once again, creating those opportunities for the water to be absorbed into the ground directly, whether it's through rain gardens, permeable surfaces, or bioswales, those are great ways that we can try to capture that rain before it's going over the surface as runoff. Higher intensity snowfall, we could increase the risk of tree branches and failing and also falling to the ground, possibly causing blackouts if they fall on utility lines. And in terms of drought, we are expected to have an increasing population, so most likely we'll have longer periods without water replenishment. So we need to think about providing water for our needs for a growing population in the future. Okay, so one of the last things I want to talk about is the plant hardiness zone. So the plant hardiness zone, if you're not familiar, is a measure of the type of vegetation that can grow in a certain region based on the coldest temperature that it gets on average throughout the year. This map is from the USDA in 2012, and currently in Illinois, you can see that in Champaign-Urbana we have a zone of 5B, which represents a minimum temperature of -15 to -10 throughout the year. You can see, though, in extreme southern Champaign County, we do actually have the next zone of Zone 6A. So it's projected as the climate warms that our lowest temperature is not going to be quite as cold. So it's expected these zones are going to shift northward in the future, possibly introducing Zone 6A and even 6B or 7A into our region. So what impact this could have is that it might change the optimal tree and plant species for central Illinois. So as we're making longer term decisions about what trees to plant, this might be something to consider. Other potential impacts on trees could be warmer and drier summers and also heavier snowfalls in the wintertime. You might want to think about different species of trees that might be a little bit more resistant to these potential changes. And finally, freeze-thaw events. Freeze-thaw events represent when temperatures in one day go from above freezing to below freezing. Freeze-thaw events puts our street surfaces at risk for cracking and potholes. In the past, our freeze-thaw cycles have been anywhere between about 10 to 20 events per year. In the future, as temperatures warm, it is expected that we could have more of these events in the early fall and also the late spring. So we could potentially see more of these events in the future. So with more freeze-thaw events, we could have our concrete more susceptible to cracking and potholes. So thinking about surfaces that may allow that water to drain out a little bit better would hopefully reduce the amount of cracking or potholes that we experience in our streets in the future. Okay, so that's all I have for you this evening. I'd be happy to take any questions if you have them.
Other questions?
I've got a question. Couple. You mentioned less significant cold temperatures might be a problem for agricultural pests in that they're not killed as thoroughly. Would the same hold true for human disease vectors?
You know, I'm not sure about that question, actually. I'd have to look into that. Yeah, I'd have to look into that more. Sorry, I don't know that off the top of my head.
I don't know if maybe you get to a certain point and it doesn't matter if it's colder, the mosquitoes die. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I definitely could probably find out the answer to that with some research that we have at the Water Survey that could help with that. So.
You also talked about changes in the precipitation regime and that we may be getting more rain, but that it may become in intense bursts. Do you know what the implications might be for groundwater? So if we get more rain, but it's in intense showers, then it all runs off, or the extra rain runs off. It doesn't percolate anyway.
Right. Yeah. I definitely think that could be an issue in the future with groundwater replenishment. Once again, other people at the Water Survey might actually know more to that because they do a lot of research on groundwater. So I could get back to you on those two issues and see if they have some more information. Like I said, just trying to provide as many opportunities for it to absorb. I mean, of course, there's also a lot of precursor, like how wet was it before that event, because if it's already saturated, it's not going to absorb. If it was fairly dry, then might be more efficient at that. So, there is a lot of shorter term things that can determine that, but I'll see if there's any other information.
Thanks.
Are there examples of communities or anyone who is starting to make planning decisions based on these scenarios? Or are people still, in the current mode and just waiting to see what happens?
There's a kind of a wide range. I think the majority of communities are they're aware of the situation, but maybe don't have the resources to do anything about it at this time as far as planning. But there definitely are some communities. Chicago is a good example of one that they're actually a fairly large leader in adaptation, looking at climate change. They have their climate change action plan for Chicago. So they really have been implementing these changes. So there are some examples in case studies. There's been a lot of look at the Great Lakes region, and there isn't quite as much as other parts of the country, but there are more and more examples that just keep coming out. So it's definitely something that is available to look at as far as what other communities are doing for this.
I can share a resource on that. When I worked at the Nature Conservancy, I know there was a team focused on adaptation and working with cities, and I know they specifically looked at coastal resilience and cities on coasts, but I'm pretty sure they had sort of case studies around the country. And I remember being fascinated by that work. I think it's a really
and that's still
important
continuing.
topic.
So they definitely have a lot of stuff there. And I'm drawing a blank on the name of the other. I think it's EcoAdapt is the other program that's trying to compile the information, and they just did release the Great Lakes study about kind of what's going on here.
I have some familiarity with the Chicago area planning, and in fact, Scott had sent us some of the planning documents. I think that were related to some of your work. Do you know whether Indianapolis has taken any measures? Because that seemed to be the other data point. For
Right. No, I'm actually not aware of whether Indianapolis. I haven't heard of them doing anything. It doesn't necessarily mean they aren't, but I haven't heard of much. So I'd have to check into that more. But at this point, I don't think I'm aware of anything.
It's been a few years, but I think since we've heard about it, but in the past, extreme weather events such as tornadoes or hurricanes are sometimes part of the storyline about climate changes. And I don't think that was part of your presentation. Was there data about those kinds of events in this most recent National Climate Assessment? Or are you familiar from other work you've done about whether there's a strong signal or not with tornadoes?
I actually don't think there has been a strong signal as far as individual severe weather events. Oftentimes today it seems like they are becoming a lot more frequent, but a lot of that has to do with the more accurate reporting of tornadoes and people there to spot them. And so that also plays in with hurricanes as well, especially when you're going back to like the early 1900s and whatnot. So actually having an accurate historical record to be able to do those studies, it does make it a little bit more difficult. So at this point, I don't really think that they have said it's going to increase severe weather or not. Another thing is strong winds. And there is some connection that there has been a slight increase in winds, but nothing drastic that a lot of research is saying we're going to deal with way more high wind events in the future. So not quite as strong of a signal as some of these other things.
And another question, I don't know if you could backspace to the, you had a slide that was, I believe, a national scale map of drought projection. Right, that's it. So this one is just about extreme precipitation, and this one's particularly for drought.
Yes, this is showing the maximum consecutive number of days with little to no precipitation. So if we go back to this one real quick, so that the maximum consecutive number of days with little to no precipitation today is about 30 to 40 days out of the year. So in the future, there could be about a 5% change today, but in the desert Southwest, maybe a 25% increase in that length of time that you could experience the dry conditions. So not too much of a change here, really, from what we're experiencing today, meaning it's might be about as prevalent as it is today in the future.
Other questions?
So I guess presented lots of information here, and this is really interesting. I guess I'm wondering if so here we are in Urbana. So there are some predicted scenarios for climate depending on season and precipitation and temperature. Do you have any, like if you had one one or two recommendations for Urbana, like, so, you're sitting there with this knowledge about possible scenarios. What are we to do with it? What kinds of recommendations?
So I think a lot of what we've seen recently also is these extreme events that we've been dealing with, whether it's heavy precipitation, heavy snowfall. And so it seems to me that those really do have a great impact on municipalities. So I think that would be a great thing to plan for, is just trying to mitigate more of flooding issues that the city might have experienced in the past, because those same flooding issues will most likely be an issue in the future. I think a lot of times you can take what's impacted the community the most in the historical sense and kind of use it as a guide to maybe what might be most important for the community. So I'd say definitely extreme precipitation is one that we've already been kind of seeing that actually happen. Maybe not necessarily here, but other places that are within the Midwest as well. And I think also the heat wave situations, we may not see a heat wave every year, but it definitely could become more frequent. So making sure that the vulnerable populations, in cities like Chicago, it's definitely more of an issue where they do have more vulnerable populations, but it's still something to think about, making sure people have access to cooling centers during the hot summer months, or even just a little water area to go cool down in the hot hours of the afternoon.
I have another question.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything in either this data set or others that you are aware of that would lead you to expect differences in agricultural irrigation in this region of the Corn Belt?
I'm not sure about that as much for the future. I know that just talking with farmers around here, they are trying to, rely a little bit less on irrigation in the future, but that's difficult with the current situation. Of course, going back to 2012, where there was a fairly bad drought. So I'm not exactly sure on kind of the impact that might have on irrigation.
Other questions? All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, and our next item on the agenda is new business, and we do not have any items there. And then moving down to announcements. Are there any announcements this evening?
I have one. Tomorrow there will be a public workshop regarding Urbana's bicycle plan. It's from 6 to 8 p.m. at the Urbana Civic Center.
And I have one last bicycle-related announcement while I'm here. It's a bit premature, but on April 15th, the Illinois Bike Summit for the entire state of Illinois is happening here in Champaign, Urbana, and it's going to be at the iHotel. And registration just opened today, so I'm very excited about that. The League of Illinois Bicyclists is partnering with Champaign County Bikes to put that on, so I encourage you all to attend if you're interested. Thanks.
Great. Any other announcements? All right. There's no more business before us. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I move to adjourn.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? We are adjourned.